Hey, what's going on, guys? This is Ben Brewster here with TreadAthletics.com. Today I want to talk to you guys about preventing early torso rotation. So this is the start of a series we're going to be doing where we basically pick a question and answer or a specific mechanical flaw, put together a couple slides and really break down kind of the underlying causes, linked mechanical issues, give you guys some tips and some things you can actually go and take into your training, into your coaching, and test out with some of your athletes. So without further ado, let's get into the video. Make sure to give this video a like or a thumbs up if you find this information valuable. That really helps out the channel. But let's get into it. So first off, what is early torso rotation? We hear this all the time, and why is it a problem? So early torso rotation, I would define as the initiation of trunk rotation happening before foot plant. So ideally, you hold off the rotation of the torso until after foot plant, and then you bring in the torso rotation into the equation. But early torso rotation would be you start to open up early, right? We're all familiar with this concept, but you end up landing open when that happens. And so instead of landing in a nice closed position with the shoulders online and the pelvis beginning to rotate, the torso comes into the throw too early and you begin to fly open, right? This is flying open that we hear all the time. This is a problem because studies have actually shown, first and foremost, that pitchers who begin to rotate before foot plant, their torso begins to open before foot plant, have a huge increase in both elbow and shoulder torques. So make sure to put that study on the screen if you guys want to go check it out. But first and foremost, from an injury standpoint, that's an issue. So it's not efficient from an injury standpoint and from an energy transfer standpoint. It's also inefficient from a velocity standpoint. So it reduces velocity by limiting dynamic hip-shoulder separation. And what I mean by this is that if we're trying to maximize velocity, we're trying to maximally utilize the kinetic chain and utilize our body as a whip. So we're trying to build tension down the mound, holding closed, holding closed, holding closed, release that tension from the pelvis, and that releasing of the pelvis at the last second creates this dynamic hip-shoulder separation between the pelvis and the torso that then slingshots the torso through. So when we don't do that effectively and we open up early, we've just missed out on a lot of potential velocity by not holding the shoulders back and letting the pelvis go. And so we're limiting all this fascial tension. We're limiting this dynamic hip-shoulder separation because we're opening up the shoulders early. So from a velocity standpoint, it's inefficient as well. It also potentially limits command because it's an example of improper sequencing. Proper sequencing is allowing that flow of energy, the kinetic chain, to unwind from the ground up through the lower half, through the pelvis, through the thoracic spine, into the scapula, into the humerus, into the forearm, into the wrist, into the ball. And so what happens is the torso bypasses this kinetic chain. Instead of waiting for the pelvis to do its job before coming into the throw, it begins to open either with the pelvis or sometimes before the pelvis. Guys already start to open up with the torso. And so it potentially limits command because athletes will default to one of two issues. When they begin to yank open, now they've lost the direction of their throw. They don't maintain that direction of the throw to be able to unwind in line. So they'll either open up and become a pusher and a dart thrower, which really harms velocity. They can find a way to make that, turn that into being a strike thrower. It's possible. But more likely what happens is guys fly open, and what happens is they still try to rotate, but they've already lost that separation, and so they really yank off hard. And you'll see guys that over-rotate do this. They yank off hard, they throw the neck, they throw the head off to the side, and they get into this over-rotated position. And now they become too rotational, and command becomes an issue. So depending on which movement solution the athlete and their body defaults to, you can potentially limit command as well. Less so if they become kind of a pushy linear thrower, more so if they land open and they really become a yanking and an over-rotating thrower. So elbow and shoulder torque, reducing velocity, and potentially limiting command. So it's obviously a big issue that we need to figure out what's affecting it and what it affects. So let's discuss linked mechanical issues. So first and foremost, most mechanical issues, right, they don't actually happen in isolation. It's not like you can just have early torso rotation and that doesn't affect anything above or below in the sequence of events that's happening in the throw. And so we need to ask the question, in our assessments, we're looking at over 60 different mechanical variables when we break down a pitcher. And an athlete, especially a slower throwing athlete, might have 20 or 30 things that come up as red flags or come up as points of caution that we might need to address and take a closer look at. Are we going to give them 20 or 30 different prescriptions for every single flaw? No. A lot of these are linked flaws, and a lot of these are upstream or downstream issues where you need to be able to trace it back, right? So these are issues that can be traced from early torso rotation, that when you have this problem where the torso rotates early, these are issues that come as a result downstream of this issue. The first is what I would call back knee drive. Now, I'm not talking about this linear move. I'm not talking about the drive towards the target. What I'm talking about is that when you land open, torso opens early, you default to this linear follow-through pattern. This linear follow-through pattern is characterized by basically a forward flexing action, right? There's two options. You can either over-rotate or you can forward flex and dart throw to the target. When you choose the forward flexing option, what happens is you begin forward crunching towards the target. Your rectus abdominis comes into play, and the movement that corresponds to that is that the back knee shoots forward. And so the back foot will pop off the ground, the back knee will shoot in aggressively, and this is a telltale sign. These are the linked patterns that the athlete has become very linear in their follow-through. So this back knee drive, if you see that, it's not, hey, let's do more reverse lunges and try to figure out how to keep that back foot on the ground. No, that's not how you address it. It doesn't work. This is a symptom of higher up the chain. Early torso rotation most of the time is what's causing this, and that's leading to that back knee shooting off the ground in response to the rectus abdominis. As this end contracts, your body begins to shoot forward into hip flexion and pop that back foot off the ground. It's not something you can just address in the weight room by doing better form reverse lunges. Front knee collapse. So as we get into this linear pattern, into ball release, as we open up early and we get into that linear pattern that we just discussed, the front knee and the front leg no longer have a good position to actually do their job well, to create an effective lead leg block. So what happens is you land open, and now the front knee has to try to block and brace purely anterior to posterior. So it tries to block, but there's nothing to really rotate against. We know that the effective lead leg block is actually the result of landing in a proper position and the pelvis completing its rotation. As the pelvis rotates completely, the glove side of your pelvis, as it completes its rotation, it actually pulls the femur into extension on this lead leg. That's what actually creates this lead leg block. It's not a slamming and extending from the quad, but when you don't effectively sequence things, when you land open, you don't give your front leg a chance to actually do that. You're not creating rotation to create that lead leg block. You're slamming from an open position, and you're just asking your front leg to act more like a car crash, in a car crash mechanism. It's just more of a front to back car crash. And so that front knee often collapses, the lead leg block deteriorates, and then coaches try to work on doing, hide-ins or doing lateral hide-ins and trying to stick the landing and act like they can address that in the weight room when really it's a downstream issue. It's not something that we need to address directly by focusing on the front leg most of the time. Occasionally you can, but if it's coming upstream, you need to be aware of that and address the upstream issue first and see what actually happens and if that cleans up the downstream issue. Elbow pushing, we talked about this. This is a paired pattern with that forward flexing action. What happens is instead of the elbow staying in line with the torso rotation, as you begin to rotate, that elbow leaks in front of the line of the shoulders as you rotate. And because you're forward flexing, it becomes a dart throw. The torso forward flexes, you can now no longer get this effective whip-like action where the arm lays back, spirals out and around, and you release in that nice extended elbow position at ball release. It becomes a slamming or a chopping action into ball release. Sometimes this can just be a bad habit from doing things like wrist weights, improperly coached or cued plyo care drills, going too heavy on plyo care drills, thinking that you need to accelerate from the tricep rather than pulling and whipping into ball release. But a lot of times it can be something is causing this linear follow through. And if we can fix that, a lot of times the pushing action of the upper half actually takes care of itself. So we need to be careful trying to address arm action issues without understanding kind of the global context of what that athlete's movement flaws are. So 3 linked mechanical issues. There are more, but these are the big ones. So now we'll look at things that might be influencing early torso rotation, things that are causing it. So these are contributing factors. The first would be muscling up. I consider this throwing too early, right? This is when athletes, they're trying to throw too soon, and so the arm action tenses up, and a lot of times they'll pull that glove side because they don't understand how to hold and build tension down the mound as they ride that linear move, how to be patient and unload the kinetic chain in sequence. They try to throw too soon, they pop out of their low half early, their torso opens up, takes over early, and they start to try to build velocity too soon in the throw before the rest of the kinetic chain has had a chance to actually unfurl and get into the proper positions. So muscling up is a big cause. We'll talk about that more. Poor mobility. So mobility can definitely play a role in not being able to hold these positions as you move down the mound, and not being able to maintain the T-spine back as the pelvis goes. So the first component would be hip internal rotation. As you move down the mound, most pitchers require a certain degree of hip internal rotation depending on the actual strategy you use to get down the mound, but you're turning the pelvis over the back femur and riding that down the mound. And so if you don't have the adequate, it's called femoral acetabular internal rotation, you don't have the ability to turn the pelvis over top of the femur, then you're more likely to open up the pelvis early and bring the T-spine with it. If you don't have that range in the back hip, you're more likely to have to land early and have to bring the pelvis open with it early versus being able to maintain it closed and open it at the last second. The second is T-spine rotation. So maybe your pelvis has adequate mobility. Maybe you have a really good linear move. You're able to get into a good position here, but now you don't have the actual mobility through your T-spine to hold your shoulders back. So you fire the pelvis and it brings the torso with it because you don't have the range to actually hold it back and create this effective dissociation where the pelvis goes, now the torso can snap through and it becomes what I would consider a segmental energy transfer, where that energy is able to transfer through each facet, each vertebrae individually in that wave of energy. So T-spine rotation, hip internal rotation are the two big areas that we'll see mobility restrictions that can contribute to early torso rotation. Early glove arm supination is the next one. Now, we're all familiar with this. We can all kind of identify it in throwers, but basically that would be an athlete breaks their hands and the first thing they do is they supinate or they turn over the glove arm early. And so maybe they just break their hands in a neutral position and at landing their palm's already facing up. They've already supinated, this is supination, early, and so that doesn't give them anything to actually hold on to hold the glove side closed, to build tension, to hold everything closed until that part of the throw actually comes into the kinetic chain. And so early glove arm supination, we'll talk about that more. And then lack of awareness or a patterning issue, right? You might not be muscling up, you might have great mobility, you might be trying to use your glove arm properly, but you might just have a lack of awareness of how to actually hold your torso back, let the pelvis go, and how to create this optimal sequencing of events. It might just be you've never been made aware of how to do this. Your body's never been able to figure out the right pattern, or it might be that you've been coached out of it through poor coaching, poor cueing, poor drills, poor drill selection. So we'll talk about this more, but forcing hip-shoulder separation is one that can definitely contribute when an athlete tries to really force the pelvis open, force the shoulders closed, and they think that they can just modify their delivery that way and force this separation. A lot of times it actually does the opposite. It actually creates less separation and it gives the athlete a chance to pop out of that lower half early and fly open with the upper half. Forward flexing towards the target, we talked about that, but a lot of athletes don't understand that it's actually about rotating with their upper half. So they get to landing, the pelvis goes. It's actually about rotating around the spine into ball release. It's not about landing and forward flexing the spine. This would be forward flexing. Some athletes have been told, pull down and into ball release or pull the lampshade or whatever, a number of cues can cause this, but they think that at landing, now their goal is to use their abs and pull down linearly. And so sometimes you can just get them out of that pattern and it's just a very simple fix because now they understand how to let the pelvis go and rotate about the spine, perpendicular to the spine. Lack of understanding how to rotate, again, we just touched on that. So let's get into each of these a little bit more detail and then we'll give you guys a couple sample drills that you can use and test out with your athletes. The first cue that we'll use for muscling up is allow the arm to work. Basically allow the arm to actually go through its path before bringing it into the throw too soon. So again, we talked about athletes trying to throw too soon. Allow the arm to go up its natural path before bringing it into the throw, right? There's a floating action. We constantly talk about floating the arm. Regardless of your path, if your path is more just straight into that high cock position, that flipped up position, or if it's more of a spiral, or if it's a little bit longer of a spiral, the commonality amongst hard throwers is that they allow the arm to work. They're patient with the arm action before they actively bring it into the throw. It's not breaking the hands and immediately trying to throw. It's letting the arm work, get into position, and then at the right instant, as the arm actually comes into the throw, now they aggressively pull into the throw. So allowing the arm to work. Again, that pretty much describes well-timed intensity, saving up the active effort from the arm until it has its time to come into the throw, until the rest of the kinetic chain has had its time, and now the arm actively becomes a component of the throw. It doesn't mean that there's no, just to clarify, it doesn't mean there's no, on an EMG study, you wouldn't see any activity at all in the muscles of the scapula, the shoulder, during the initial arm swing. It just means that during this initial phase, there's relatively less active effort from your brain. You're still going to see some small amount of EMG activity if you were to study it. If you were to look at what happens in the shoulder during this period, you're going to see something in there. It doesn't take no effort, but in your brain, that's very helpful for athletes that muscle up to imagine that there's no effort. So that's important to know. One additional cue that I'll throw in that I didn't put in the slides that I think is a very helpful cue for this is to think about the arm path during the initial phase, the initial arm swing, as kind of like a puppet master. And you're like, what does that mean? Well, the puppet master is basically the scapula, right? You have the puppet, it's controlled by strings, and as the puppet master moves his hand, right, this is the equivalent of the scapula, the proximal segment. You have the puppet, and the puppet is at the mercy of what the puppet master is doing. It's the same thing with your throwing arm. The arm is at the mercy of what your scapula is doing. If I move my scapula, the ball, my hand, my forearm, this is the puppet. And so my scapula is the puppet master. Again, regardless of the arm path, I can be a little bit more out here, I can be a little bit longer. The hand, the ball, this is the puppet, and the puppet master is the scapula. And so moving more through floating the scapula around the rib cage to get into these positions can really help avoid muscling up the throw too soon. And so that's a really helpful cue as well, is kind of the puppet master cue. And then holding the glove side scap towards the target. That can help prevent early torso rotation as well. So for me, this was a helpful cue. You can think of this as you move towards the target, you're showing your numbers to the target as long as possible. You can also think about it as showing this scapula towards the target as long as possible, and then unloading. This doesn't work for everybody. Not everybody has the ability to counter rotate to that extent. But for certain guys, that can be a very, very helpful cue. There's a lot of big leaguers that have extreme counter rotation, and for them, that actually creates optimal timing. So for certain guys, that's a very useful cue to test. Poor mobility. So this is where the assessment is critical. With our athletes, we take them through an extremely comprehensive movement assessment remotely, and so they'll send us over 40 plus videos. We're looking head to toe, joint by joint. Where are they having movement restrictions? Where can they move well? Where do they have stability issues? What are the constraints within their body, and what degrees of mobility do they actually have? And that helps us identify better how that interacts with their actual mechanics. And if there's some sort of issue with their mechanics, we can cross-reference that with their actual movement assessment and see, okay, what are some of these potentially linked issues? Are they popping out of their lower half early because they have poor hip range of motion, poor hip rotation? Are they opening up early because they have no thoracic rotation? And so we'll be able to pair up each mechanical flaw with potential mobility or stability flaw or strength flaws as well. Once you've narrowed down the actual cause, let's say it is thoracic rotation, then again, it's a little bit outside the scope of this presentation, but we'll build out a specific routine for each athlete for each of their issues, both mechanically and from a mobility standpoint. And that might include things like tissue work to work on any sort of adhesions or tissue density points, active stretching and end range strengthening, something like a functional range conditioning protocol to work on improving that range and control in that new range, in that end range. And then it might include exercises to work on integrating that new range of motion into a more throwing specific or into a more sports specific pattern. So once you've isolated, improved tissue quality through the T-spine, maybe now you do some, maybe you're on a table or just half kneeling or something like that, improving your T-spine rotation at end range, and now you want to integrate it into some sort of throwing specific pattern, some sort of medicine ball throw, some sort of rotational chop, something where you integrate it. Early glove arm supination. We talked about this a little bit already, but holding internal rotation torque is a good cue to use. Again, if you do like a sleeper stretch, just as a way to feel what I'm kind of talking about, you're going to feel a little bit of a winding on the posterior aspect of the shoulder. The posterior cuff is kind of posterior capsule, and posterior cuff is winding a little bit of tension. We're not trying to necessarily stretch the posterior cuff as we throw, but that kind of feeling and cue to tell an athlete, hey, I want you to hold your glove side closed as you move towards the target so that it doesn't turn over too soon, so that it turns over at the right time versus immediately flipping over into supination. So holding internal rotation torque can be a helpful way to think about it, whether they're a little bit higher, a little bit lower, a little bit tighter. That's a helpful way. That was a very important cue for me. Breaking with the thumb down is kind of the same idea, but it's a little bit of a simpler way to explain it, especially if you're working with a younger athlete who doesn't understand what this means. is, hey, break with the thumb down instead of breaking with the thumb up and coming out of it early. So that's just a very simple way to explain the same thing. Edwin Diaz, just a really obvious example of that. He's not even breaking with the thumb down. He's breaking with the palm completely turned over, facing the sky. So we can watch that right here. He's completely turned over so that at landing, he has all this tension wound up in the glove side, and he can unwind that. And so he's using that as a way to actually hold the torso closed as long as possible. You're not going to necessarily have athletes that are able to do it to this extent, or that should do it to this extent. You're going to have extremely good shoulder internal rotation range of motion to be able to even get in that position. Pronation, there's a number of things that you'd have to have very good mobility in to be able to do that. But that's just an example of what I'm talking about so that you guys can see. And then finally, lack of awareness or patterning issue. Right, so the athlete just hasn't learned. It's like riding a bike. You've never learned how to ride a bike. You try to ride a bike, you're going to struggle at first. You've never been taught how to kind of go through those dynamic positions and maintain your balance as you're moving on the bike. It's just a pattern that they haven't learned. Even though they might have the mobility, they might have the strength, they might be able to do a reverse lunge heavy and be totally fine, but they just haven't learned how to actually put it all together dynamically. So, we've talked about trying to force hip-shoulder separation. A big way that I improved my ability to create that separation and hold the shoulders back was, and I've talked about this before, reducing tension in my hips and low back as I rotate. So I used to think that it was about muscling your hips through as fast as possible, right? It was about trying to rotate your pelvis as hard as you could. And it ended up hurting my back several times doing so. In high school, it was trying to swing and power my hips through as fast as possible. In college, it happened again with throwing. And coming back from the injury, I accidentally stumbled upon this because I was trying not to hurt my back again, and so I was rehab throwing. And I was just letting the throw work. I was letting my low back actually relax, trying to ride my backside, let it relax into rotation, and just let the throw unwind. And I noticed, hey, I was throwing 2, 3, 4 miles an hour harder at lower effort than I ever did before. And so not trying to force hip-shoulder separation ironically creates better hip-shoulder separation and allows you to hold that torso closed longer because you're able to relax into these positions. It's the same idea if you watch kind of Michael Phelps doing his arm swings. If you just asked him to reach back behind his body as far as he could, he's going to get stuck somewhere back here. He's going to get pretty far, but he's going to get stuck. He's not going to be able to just statically touch his hands together. But when you swing, now you have the ability through that relaxation to actually access more range of motion behind your body than you would be able to actively. So by relaxing your low back, relaxing your hips, you can actually access more range of motion, maximally stimulate the stretch shortening cycle versus trying to brute force these positions such as hip-shoulder separation. Trying to forward flex to the target, we already touched on this. Lack of understanding to rotate. They don't understand how to rotate around the spine. They think that it's just forward flexing and pulling straight down. We touched on that. And so I just wanted to show you, myself in high school, I think I was throwing upper 70s here. I threw 73 the year before this. But let's just talk about what we just touched on. So watch the glove arm first. What happens? I supinated early. I don't have anything to actually hold tension on the front side. And so I land, I'm right here. What happens with the torso? Obviously early torso rotation. So let's watch me as I go through it at landing. So I'm landing, already primarily open with the upper half. What happens there? We've touched on the forward flexing. From here, I forward flex towards the target and push. So let's watch that. Forward flexing towards the target. There's a head snap right there, and I end up pushing the ball towards the target. What happens next? The back knee kicks in. That's the back knee drive I was talking about, where the back knee shoots forward. And so, well, let's also look at the front leg. The front leg doesn't work properly either. The front leg's trying to block an anterior to posterior direction versus blocking in a proper position and letting the pelvis extend the front leg. So all the flaws that we've already talked about, I was demonstrating here, which is why I was throwing so slow. Here's 97 on flat ground a couple years ago. And again, you'll see all the same things are fixed. These aren't permanent issues that can't be fixed after age 12, like some gurus will tell you, like, hey, you can never fix your mechanics. I'm not saying I have perfect mechanics by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm saying the front leg blocks and extends, the back knee doesn't shoot forward, the front side is closed, I'm winding tension on the glove arm. All these other components have been addressed, and that's a big reason why I eventually was able to learn how to throw hard. It was a patterning and an awareness issue for me, not simply some sort of mobility issue. I had amazing mobility, when I was in high school. I just didn't know how to use it. I didn't know how to build tension as I move forward down the mound and unwind that tension. We're getting towards the end of the video, but I want to give you guys some drill suggestions that you can use. So we built out a custom drill prescription for each flaw, each mobility issue, each mechanical flaw for each guy. A piece of that is what we call our pre-throwing feels drills, right? These are things that help them feel, in this case, dissociation between the pelvis and the torso, or how to keep the torso closed. They'll do these before they're throwing to help ingrain what they're trying to accomplish in their throwing. And so it's kind of mobility, but it's really more integrating their mobility work into their throwing. It's the bridge between the two. So we'll start with something kind of slow if they really can't feel it. We call this dissociation feels. I'll put a video up overlaid here, but the idea is, can they even move the pelvis independently of the torso? And so you'll find that a lot of athletes actually don't have this capability. So this is an example where the assessment becomes the exercise. This is one of our assessments. Can they rotate the pelvis underneath their torso in something as simple as just, hey, stand here and move the pelvis without moving the torso together? A lot of athletes can't do that. That's where you have to start if they're having a separation or an early torso rotation issue. So starting slow. Then we'll go to something maybe a little bit faster, try to integrate that feeling. Swiss ball rotations are a good option there. As you hold the pelvis closed and rotate, you have a Swiss ball holding your upper half back to a cable stack or a band. Because you have this resistance holding your upper half back, you can really feel the pelvis go. You can feel a stretch being created through that anterior oblique sling, and now you can feel the firing. So it really helps to feel the dissociation between the pelvis and the torso, feel the upper half held back at landing. This could be used for hitters and throwers, and from there, fire. So it really encourages the optimal sequencing and positions that we're talking about. So it's a little bit faster, but it's not as fast as a throw because it's loaded. Now we can get to something that's even faster. So this is the fastest. This would be things like medicine ball throws, where you try to integrate the same feeling of holding the torso back and closed as the pelvis goes, and then firing, feeling the kinetic chain in a little bit of a faster motion. And so we have various medicine ball throws to work on this as well. But just an example of one progression for one athlete who maybe struggles with early torso rotation. But again, we have a number of different variations just for this flaw alone, and we'll build that out individually for every single flaw that an athlete might have. So that's the presentation. I'm trying to keep these from getting too extended, too long, but we're going to be planning to do a lot more of these moving forward. If you guys found this video helpful, again, make sure to give it a like, make sure to give it a thumbs up. If you're not subscribed to this channel, subscribe. We're trying to get to 20,000 followers on YouTube by the end of the year. We're trying to make this the most valuable free baseball content on the internet. So if you feel like you got something out of this video, again, make sure to do that, make sure to share it, comment below if you have any questions, and we'll see you in the next video.